Nicolas is someone I've only met previously electronically via email. We've printed several of his pieces in Changelinks and on the Changelinks website. He's a writer and researcher with Code Pink, who has done a lot of tremendously important work exposing the perpetuity of the military-industrial complex through administrations going back and going forward, and the importance of maintaining a vigil against the presence of that same militaristic practice and thought in the incoming administration and the choices it's already making. I'll allow Nicolas to say a little bit more about himself and to take the podium, so to speak, here, and give us some really important information about that perpetrating and perpetuating of war and violence, whether the Trump administration is gone, the incoming administration has the same propensities or choices that it is making and needs to be challenged on. Nicolas, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, that was inspiring to me, listening to all of you talking about your friend and leader and mentor, George Regas. So I thought I would start by talking a little bit about someone who's been a mentor to me during these last 20 years of constant war and horror. And this is someone I first heard of about a week after September the 11th, as all we were hearing on the media was talk of retaliation and war and trading violence for violence. And, we can see, looking back now after 20 years, that all this has done is to fuel an endless spiral of violence, with both sides and all sides using the violence of their enemies as a pretext for more escalations of violence on their own side. I commend all of you for standing so strongly and firmly, and unwaveringly to oppose all this. The person I'm going to talk about is Ben Ferencz, who wrote the preface to my book about the war in Iraq, which is called Blood on Our Hands. And he is still with us. He turned 100 years old this past year. He is the last surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg war crimes tribunals. He was the chief investigator for the American war crimes trials, which were held after the international ones. And he was the chief prosecutor for the Einsatzgruppen trial, which the Associated Press at the time called the largest murder trial in history, because it was trying these SS officers for the murders of over 1 million people. He is also the father of the International Criminal Court. During the Vietnam War, he gave up his own legal practice in New York and dedicated the rest of his life to the establishment of an international criminal court, really to universalize what he had experienced at Nuremberg, so that all war criminals could be held accountable, and that international law could truly serve as a deterrent to war. But anyway, so a week after September the 11th, I was driving to the beach here in Miami, and all of a sudden, in the midst of all this war talk, somebody came on NPR, Ben Ferencz, being interviewed by Katie Clark, who has since become a member of the Afghan Analysts Network and done, incredible work over the last 20 years. But she was questioning Ben about a letter he had written, urging for, the US response to September the 11th, to the crimes of September the 11th, this was a crime, not a, an attack by another country, that the response should be law, not war, and that those responsible should be identified and found and tried for their crimes. And so Katie asked him, she said, so we can talk about that in a moment, but first, do you think that the talk of retaliation is not a legitimate response to the death of 5,000 people? And Ben God bless him, said, what if the world had listened, could have now avoided 20 years of war. He said simply, quote, "It is never a legitimate response to punish people who are not responsible for the wrong done." And Katie Clark sort of recoiled, and she said, "No one is saying we're going to punish those who are not responsible." And Ben said, "We must make a distinction between punishing the guilty and punishing others. If you simply retaliate en masse by bombing Afghanistan, let us say, or the Taliban, you will kill many people who don't believe in what has happened, who don't approve of what has happened." So Clark said, so you're saying there is no appropriate role for the military in this? And he went on to say, well, yes, maybe there is some role, but I won't read you the whole interview. You can read it at his website, which is benference.org, under his various interviews organized in time frame. And if you go to 2001, you can find Benjamin Ferencz interviewed on radio by Katie Clark. The next time I came across Ben Ferencz was the first time at the end of 2004 that I wrote an article about the illegality of the Iraq War. It was something that had become pretty interesting to me as we watched, the wars first on Afghanistan and then in Iraq, spiral into greater and greater violence. And, all our demonstrations, 30 million people took to the streets around the world to try and stop the US government from doing this unthinkable act of attacking and invading Iraq. And basically I wrote an article which I entitled "From Nuremberg to Fallujah," and, basically just laid it out that, under the United Nations Charter, countries agreed in 1945 to settle their differences peacefully. And, and in the Chapter 2 of the UN Charter, it says that, the use of force, the threat or use of force is prohibited. This was clearly not a case of self-defense. People argued it in the case of Afghanistan. But again, I mean, the basic principle that Ben laid out, is the basic principle we should all adhere to. If a wrong is done, those who should be held accountable are those who were responsible. And as we see these wars, which I estimate that they have killed millions, probably somewhere in the range of 5 or 6 million people killed, which is, 2,000 times more than the number of people who died on September the 11th. So anyway, I wrote this article, but I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't totally sure of the ground I was standing on. And so I before submitting the article for publication, I sent it I sent it out to be reviewed by every lawyer I knew, all my lawyer friends, and I also just happened to have come across Ben Ferentz's email address at the time, so I sent it to him too, you know. And of course, out of all those lawyers, the last one I expected to actually get a reply from was this, you know, esteemed Nuremberg prosecutor. But in fact, he was the only one who did write back. None of my other lawyer friends even, you know, bothered to reply. But then all of a sudden in my inbox, I got this email from Ben Ferenc, and subject line, "Congratulations." Yeah, thank you, there he is. And it just said simply, "Congratulations, you have written a clear, accurate, and intelligent account of how we are involved in aggression in Iraq." And of course, aggression is the crime, one of the 3 crimes that the Germans were charged with at Nuremberg, and one of the ones for which many of them were actually sentenced to death, including 13 of the defendants at the trial that Ben prosecuted. He did not request the death penalty. He does not believe in the death penalty, but and you know, several of them were in fact executed. One was released by John Mccloy, the American governor of Germany, who had been a lawyer for IG Farben before the war. One of the Einsatzgruppen commanders happened to be, I think it was the son or a close relative of one of the former top executives of IG Farben. So that one got away. You know, John Mccloy is just you know, dark figure in US history, rarely commented on, you know, but then of course ended up being Alan Dulles' deputy on the Warren Commission that whitewashed the, you know, the assassination of President Kennedy. But so anyway, you know, when I wrote my book, you know, my publisher said, well, you know, you need to find somebody who people have actually heard of to, you know, write an introduction or a preface. And of course, Ben agreed to, which was, again, was just, you know, he has never been anything but, you know, totally supporting of my work. And and then after my book came out, David Swanson had a book come out about the same time called War is a Crime. And we decided to do an event together here in South Florida. I was working with PDA at the time, and the PDA chapter leader in Palm Beach County, Nancy Parker, really arranged the whole event and did an amazing job. She and her husband, you know, were kind of TV producers, did a lot of TV commercials for Dennis Kucinich, and I happen to know that Ben spends his winters in Boynton Beach, not far from Boca Raton. So, you know, really kind of at the last minute, David and I thought, well, why don't we just invite him to come and speak too? And once again, Ben agreed to, and of course he was the star of the show, really. And so I just want to, and what he said in his talk there was, again, just, you know, just an absolute indictment of the US government, and US wars and US policy. You know, we'll get on to Joe Biden in a minute and his role in all of this, but you know, I mean, I think most of us are cautious and reluctant about sort of drawing comparisons between, you know, the United States and the United States serial aggression against other countries around the world and the mass mass casualties caused by that. You know, Ben isn't shy about that, and so he talked about the trial and about how, in fact, the defense of the Germans, the lead defendant was SS Gruppenführer Otto Ohlendorf. That's, you know, the equivalent of a general, and he was really in overall command of all the Einsatzgruppen who were following the German troops into Poland and Russia, and just in each town that was invaded, you know, they went through and they just sorted out, pulled out all the quote undesirables, the Polish or Russian officials, you know, Polish or Russian military, people identified strongly as communists, Jews, gypsies, everybody, and they you know, and they just killed them all with, you know, firing squads or machine guns, and buried them in mass graves. And so, you know, Ben confronted Ohlendorf in the courtroom, and as he said, Otto Ohlendorf explained why it was that he reported that they had killed 90,000 Jews, and he calmly declared that it was necessary in self-defense. And Ben asked him, what do you mean self-defense? Germany attacked Poland, Norway, Holland, Sweden, France. Nobody attacked Germany. Where's the self-defense? And he said, well, we knew the Soviets were planning to attack us, so we had to attack them in self-defense. And why did you kill all the Jews? Well, everyone knows the Jews were in favor of the Bolsheviks, so you have to kill all the Jews too. Why the little children? Why did you kill all the little children? And this is very telling if we think about, you know, Abu Rahman al-Awlaki, for instance, and so many other children who have been killed, you know, inevitably in these wars, if not deliberately. Although in al-Awlaki's case, it was deliberate. And Ohlendorf said, well, if they grow up and they become enemies of Germany when they find out what happened to their parents, that would be dangerous, a threat to our long-range security. So we'd better get rid of them too. So as Ben, okay, I mean, I'll go on just reading from the transcript of what Ben said. He said, he was saying to me, don't you see the logic of it all? And I said, didn't you have any qualms about killing all these people, little children and all that? No, he said, because we rely on the head of state, Hitler. He had more information than I had, and he told us that the Soviets planned to attack. So it was necessary in presumed self-defense. In our military jargon, we call such assaults a preemptive first strike. The US military policy today does not preclude first strike by the United States in order to prevent a presumed attack by the other side. But that Ohlendorf argument was considered by 3 American judges at Nuremberg, and they sentenced him and 12 others to death by hanging. So it's very disappointing to find that my government today, this is Ben speaking, is prepared to do something for which we hanged Germans as war criminals. So, you know, this is someone who has spent his life working for the rule of law, and he has a slogan that he uses: law, not war. And and you know, I think underlying all our criticism of the US government and our activism to oppose, you know, these systematic crimes, you know, we really should recognize that what is happening here is that the US government, as while, you know, paying lip service to a rule-based international order and a rule-based world, has, since the end of the Cold War in particular, placed itself above and outside and in, you know, systematic total violation and disdain for the rule of law. You know, in the United States, even, I mean, I know, because I mean, I've been talking about this for a long time to a lot of people, and people tend to, in the US, for reasons that, you know, we can understand why our leaders would propagate these ideas, that, you know, the rule of law is not that important. The rule of international law is not that important. It doesn't really mean anything. You know, this is how it's sort of dismissed by, you know, people like John Bolton, but also not really taken seriously by our politicians on either side. And here we come to Joe Biden, because when the first open, flagrant, massive use of force by the US and its allies as we lead up to 2001 was the bombing campaign against the Rump of Yugoslavia in 1999, when the US and NATO didn't even go to the UN Security Council to try and justify it. They just dropped tens of thousands of bombs, you know, not just on Kosovo, but on Belgrade and all over Syria. I mean, all over Serbia. I mean, they even bombed the Chinese embassy because it was reportedly being used as a communications node by the Serbians trying to defend themselves. And in fact, as I've written recently, you know, we now find out that Hashim Thaçi, who sat next to Madeleine Albright at Rambouillet, you know, to present absolutely you know, impossible terms to Serbia, essentially asking them to agree to, you know, total occupation of their country by NATO. He is now awaiting trial at The Hague for the most, you know, crimes that when they were first revealed by Carla Del Ponte, the prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, when she first, and she didn't bring charges because she had no cooperation from NATO that was occupying Kosovo to investigate or to bring charges. But those charges have now been brought, and they charge that under cover of the NATO bombing of Serbia, you know, which destroyed, you know, a great deal of the civilian infrastructure of Serbia, schools, hospitals, the electric supply, the water supply. You know, this was really total war. And what our allies, what the US allies were doing was capturing Serbian prisoners, shipping them across the border to Albania, and killing them so that they could sell their internal organs on the international transplant market. And as I say, when these charges were first unveiled, I mean, it just sounded incredible. And yet there is now a prosecution team at The Hague who has it's taken 20 years, but they have brought charges, and Tsatsiki now faces prosecution along with some of his other KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army members or leaders, because I mean, they were just gangsters. They were gangsters who the CIA found to create chaos, to arm and support and give money to, and to create chaos in Kosovo, as the CIA does to prepare the stage for war. So when Kofi Annan who was the Secretary General of the UN at the time, when he declared, publicly that sorry, just reading something on the chat. When he declared publicly that this war was illegal under the UN Charter, somebody asked Joe Biden about that. He was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Surely he, would understand whether this was true or not. And Biden just completely dismissed it out of hand. He said, Annan has got it flat wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There is no one in the US Senate who believes that. And I think he said, no one. I think he repeated it 3 times. And so, yeah, this is Biden. So when we talk about just the illegality, the fact that the US has divorced itself from the development of international law, and with complete disdain for it, and just I mean, it has to be said that because Americans don't see this, the development of international law has moved on regardless. There have been important treaties signed that most of the world has joined. For instance, the Landmine Treaty, has saved tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives of children, because about 3/4 of the countries in the world have signed on to it and no longer use landmines. The Cluster Munitions Treaty, which is more recent, I think it was 2008. But not a single there's over 100 countries have signed and ratified that treaty, and not one of the countries that signed on to it has used cluster munitions since then. So, international law is not just pieces of paper, as American politicians and commentators, with allegiance to both parties, like to believe. On Wikipedia, if you Google treaties the US has not signed or ratified, there's a list of close to 50 important multilateral treaties that that have the standing of international law, because most of the world have a binding international law, because most of the world has agreed to them, but the US has not. And they go back 50 odd or so years, and they include basic, simple things like the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. The United States is the only country on earth that has not signed that treaty, because essentially the US came to a point after the end of the Cold War where it saw our leaders saw themselves as the world's sole superpower. Leading up to, and they really thought they could dispense, they no longer needed the protection of international law for themselves, because they had such overwhelming military power that in fact, international law was just becoming an impediment to what they wanted to do. So, when we hear Mike Pompeo, criticizing China, because they don't subscribe to, the US-led rules-based international order, but it is not China who has been committing, the crime of war, the crime of aggressive war for which people were hanged at Nuremberg. As Jimmy Carter said recently to his Sunday school class, that he had called up Trump, or Trump had called him, and Trump was whining about all his problems with China, and Carter said, well, what have they been doing? They've been investing in economic development. They have lifted 800 million people out of poverty. That's according to the World Bank. That's probably a conservative number. And almost completely eliminated extreme poverty. And what has the US been doing? Waging war after war after war, spending 65% of our federal discretionary revenue, discretionary spending on the military and the various, adjuncts to it. And so, I mean, I can't remember exactly what Carter said to Trump, but basically, I mean, why would we be surprised at this point that they have a more dynamic and healthy economy than we do? It shouldn't be a surprise. And, for us now to threaten them militarily, as people like Michel Flournoy, and as I'm afraid too many of our politicians, too many figures already nominated for important positions in the Biden administration seem to go along with this. This is what we are in danger of here right now. I believe the greatest danger is that even as these murderous counterterrorism wars continue, because the US refuses to sort of back down and stop this spiral of violence. At the same time, since Obama, our government has been trying to pivot to Asia, pivot to what they are now calling a new Cold War, which of course is really just a reversion to the old Cold War. And really, I mean, in terms of China, what is different from the old Cold War is that China is now a wealthy, dynamic economy, whereas back during the 50s, 60s, 70s, at the height of the old Cold War, the US was clearly the dominant economic power in the world. It really won a sort of economic competition with Russia, today, the US international trade and the US GNP measured by purchasing power parity are about 15% of the global economy and global trade. That's about equal to China and about equal to the European Union. And yet even all three of them together don't add up to even half the global economy. So we are now truly living in a multipolar world, the multipolar world that many have predicted for some time. And yet the US, by focusing on military power, military destructive power, and investing so many of our resources in it, and now launching on a new, marching back into this Cold War with Russia and China, and the arms race that accompanies that. Essentially, that is a choice that the US can only pursue today at the cost of further declines in American living standards and at great, great risk of a war of unprecedented mass destruction, including of our own country. And yet, our leaders seem to be sleepwalking into exactly that. As far as Biden goes, let's talk first about the actual wars the US is waging, and Biden's record. He was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee during the run-up to the Iraq War, and the role he played really was to hold hearings, in which the opposition to the war was never heard. The case against war was never heard in Joe Biden's committee, and so he helped to marshal votes for war among his colleagues in the Senate. In the Obama administration, Biden commendably argued against Obama's escalation of the war in Afghanistan. But when Obama's surge failed, Obama reverted to the policy that Biden had favored all along, and which really became the hallmark of Obama's war strategy globally, which I've referred to many times as the doctrine of covert and proxy war. Which very substantially reduced US casualties and got all these wars really off American television screens and out of the media, because thousands of Americans were no longer being killed. But of course, the price for that on the other side is just the huge reliance on air power, the reliance on proxies and CIA to really just plunge countries into chaos, which then in the case of Syria, produced the Islamic State, and then led to the heaviest US bombing campaign since the first Gulf War, against Syria and Iraq, in which two major cities were completely destroyed. Mosul in Iraq, the independent newspaper in the UK, Patrick Coburn, who some of you may be familiar with, a fantastic Middle Eastern reporter, he spoke to Hoshyar Zebari, the Kurdish former foreign minister of occupied Iraq, and he said that he had seen Kurdish military intelligence reports in which the invading Kurdish and Iraqi troops in Mosul had identified the bodies of more than 40,000 civilians killed, mostly by the US bombing and artillery and rockets. The US Marines had a huge base outside the city they called Rocket City, where they were just launching thousands of HIMARS rockets into the city. The Americans, French, and Iraqis had, heavy artillery, howitzers pouring shells into the city. These are not precision weapons. This is mass destruction on an industrial scale. And those 40,000, as the Kurdish report actually said, was, a small number, because they at that point they couldn't possibly count probably thousands more bodies buried under the rubble. If you've seen any pictures of Mosul, especially the old city, which was sort of the final holdout of the Islamic State there. It's just, I mean, it looks like, pictures of Warsaw or Berlin at the end of World War II, really. And then after that, of course, no global outrage about that. So they went on to do the same or worse to Raqqa in Syria. So, I mean, this reliance on air power, as, like Nixon's when he started, his peace plan for, getting the US out of Vietnam. Again, same story, just massive reliance on air power. So, so Biden has never really said anything about that, He hasn't really been forced to, but clearly this is a part of the strategy he supported. And also the counterterrorism. I mean, and, he also now claims that he opposed the invasion of Libya, in which the US, NATO, and their allies, waged a proxy war under a UN resolution that said they could use force to protect civilians, and expressly prohibited an invasion or occupation of Libya under any circumstances. And yet they sent in hundreds of Qatari, mostly actually Pakistani, special operations forces and Western mercenaries, British ex-SAS people and other former Western special operations forces. So there were hundreds or thousands of these guys on the ground. They were the ones, calling in the NATO airstrikes, because as the Qatari general in charge said, well, the Libyan rebels were civilians. They didn't have the skills to do this, so we had to do that for them. But of course, this was all hush-hush at the time. Actually, Medea Benjamin and I have an article coming out in the February issue of Progressive magazine titled The War Machine Under New Management. So look out for that in the Progressive. That'll be online too, but I'm not sure if you need a subscription to see it. But anyway, so yeah, on Libya, Biden now says that he opposed it, and maybe he did. But in fact, on the day that Obama announced the gruesome assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, Biden spoke at Plymouth State College, and he said, quote, "NATO got it right. In this case, America spent $2 billion and didn't lose a single life." This is a Bidenism. This is more the prescription for how to deal with the world as we go forward than it has in the past. I think his meaning's clear, as garbled as it is. So, typical politician in that sense. But and we're also looking at West Africa, where under Trump, the war that, the US in 2005 formed an alliance with 11 West African countries, to oppose jihadism and Al-Qaeda and militant extremism, all of that. And, predictably, that has just blown up into, just greater and greater and greater violence. I mean, it hasn't, there is now, violence raging in many of those countries where it wasn't before. Nick Turs did a great report on this from Vice, and he quoted the Pentagon's Africa Center for Strategic Studies, that reports 8,000 people killed in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso in the last year, 1,000 violent incidents, and that this is a 7-fold increase in the last 3 years. So here we have another of these counterterrorism wars spiraling out of control. But this shift from, what the Petraeus McChrystal strategy in Afghanistan that they called counterinsurgency, this shift to counterterrorism, which is actually what is fueling many of these wars, especially all over Africa, is precisely what Biden supported under the Obama administration. So we should be very concerned about that, and whether he has learned anything, or changed his views on any of this. He really so rarely gets asked and answers in such boilerplate that it is very hard to be sure exactly what his policies will be. But obviously we all have to be ready, as you guys clearly are, to be the voices of peace, and to oppose the continuation of these wars and the incredible danger of this new Cold War with China and Russia.
Thank you. This is an important message coming at a very important time for us, because we're all breathing a sigh of relief that we have elected a war criminal to the White House, in my immoderate opinion. So I would like to turn it over perhaps to Michael to tell us, or to be the sub-facilitator to call on people who have questions for Nicolas.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so Bonnie put a question into the chat, has her hand up. Why don't you go ahead, Bonnie, and then maybe I'll ask Kwasi to say a little more in a minute after that.
Put 2 things in the chat. The question I would really like to ask, well, we have an expert here, is a little more about Anthony Blinken, presumptive Secretary of State. I understand.
Blinken, yeah.
Blinken, and who else in Biden's war cabinet should we really be watching besides Blinken?
Well, yeah, Blinken does not have a good record either. He's less clearly identified with any specific policy because he was in more junior positions in the Obama administration. But he's been at Biden's side through all of this, from the Senate, where he was, the lead staffer, I think, for the Foreign Relations Committee. And then, with Biden as vice president, and then promoted to senior positions in the National Security Council and the State Department, under Obama, and now Secretary of State, if he is confirmed.
I heard that he was the
very,
one.
very, very wary of
I had
his
heard
policy.
that he was the one who designed the plan to divide Iraq, post-war Iraq, into 3 parts.
Various people were suggesting that back, because frankly, at the height of the Iraq War, America was really in trouble there. And so people were coming up with crazy ideas like that. My position was always that this was an illegal invasion. It's an illegal occupation. The first thing we have to do is to get, the illegal occupation force out of there. And then hopefully, the world collectively, the UN, legitimate forces can help the Iraqis to put their country back together again. But I said that to a staffer at Senator Nelson's office and from Florida. And I remember, I was saying, that's the problem. The problem is that it's an illegal invasion and an illegal occupation. She said, well, Brother, whatever you think about the invasion, that was in the past, but that has nothing to do with what's happening there now, because of course in the US media, this was all framed as a centuries old civil war, when in fact, there had never been such, conflict between Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq. Unless you go back to sort of wars between the Ottoman and Persian empires back in the, 17th century or something. But yeah, so Blinken, yeah, I think, we just have to stand prepared. I mean, there were good things in Biden's platform. He talked about restoring diplomacy as the principal tool of US foreign policy. But now what does that mean? Because Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, she would talk about diplomacy, but what she meant was brinksmanship. She meant assembling coalitions to, oppose our enemies, and to threaten them and hold their feet to the fire. And, that's not diplomacy, that is brinksmanship. And so, what does Biden mean by diplomacy? Will he pursue peaceful resolutions to, US-Russian relations and US-China relations? That's obviously what we all want. And we are just going to have to be so vigilant and so ready to respond and act, whenever Biden does the wrong thing. And we do have some more allies now on the inside. With Code Pink, Code Pink has now started something called Code Pink Congress, which is led by someone you probably all know, Marcy Winograd, who formerly ran for Congress in LA. So she is coordinating this effort by Code Pink to really interact with Congress, to work with, this new generation of progressive members of Congress, the squad, which is growing, and with anyone who will work with us on the inside,
Okay, my question is, and I knew about the Nuremberg trials and all these other things, but I just got a message regarding Trump's impeachment, and I'm looking at the now, and I look at what happened 2 days ago, that was planned. It was not something that just happened on incident. There was too many things with the Molotov cocktails and all the other different things that happened. It was something planned. So what can we do now? What can we do now about this, the 20th, and about this month? What can we do as a group?
Well,
Okay,
people have been talking. Sorry.
Hold the
I was
answer.
going to follow Robert's suggestion. We take 2 or 3 questions. So why don't you go ahead, Carol Francis?
Oh, okay.
And I had a comment also, and then we'll go
Yeah.
back to you, Nicholas.
I really hope that we can use your information that you've given us for us to write as a board of the ICUJP an open letter to Biden. And if you want to contribute to that, it would be really great.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you could give us a little picture of the changing politics of working on these issues in Miami, because it's something different from the rest of the country. I'd love to hear about it. Do you work with Andres Gomez on Cuba? And what else is going on in Miami for peace and
I think I know Andres Gomez. I haven't been that involved. I mean,
Hold that answer until
we have a coalition.
That's all right.
We have a coalition here that I have been involved with on Cuba and Venezuela. And, I mean, until COVID, we had some good rallies. We're now there are now car caravans. There's a car caravan once a month to end the embargo on Cuba. And that has is getting growing support, you know, especially from young Cuban Americans, the next generation, who, you know, do not share, you know, the political views of their parents and grandparents. In the election, we saw how, you know, the red baiting still works. And I mean, one of the big part of how Trump won Florida this time was simply by coming to Miami and banging the old red baiting drum. And I know I have Cuban friends who think Biden is a communist, you know. I mean, it's completely absurd. But of course, immigrant populations are vulnerable. And the Spanish language Cuban radio in Miami is toxic. Univision and Telemundo, which I think are both based in Miami, I mean, they're not much better. And I mean, I have a friend, a Colombian woman who's lived in Venezuela. A lot of her family live in Venezuela. And so I sort of get, you know, readouts on that community from her. And after the election, what she said was that, oh, Maduro sent millions of people across the Mexican border to vote for Biden. And that's how they stole the election. So,
I just want to take a quick moment. I had a comment and I wanted to respond to it. Ruby, you know, I think Ruby was asking what we can do. And I think the two things we have already scheduled are our own protest on Monday, virtual online event, and then the car caravan on the 18th, the following Monday. I think what's really critical about that is it links, both of them should link the question of peace and justice. There's a direct connection between the US prison and industrial complex and Guantanamo and the torture that took place in Abu Ghraib. Some of it was carried out by US prison guards in the US military. And the same thing is true of the January 18th Martin Luther King Day protest, that it links the question of the war at home and the violence by law enforcement and the suborning of Nazi violence by law enforcement in this country that we just saw with the war machine. So I think those are the actions that we are committed to. We should, you know, emphasize those aspects in both of them and support them. I did want to say that you raised the question of red baiting and you raised the question of humanitarian war. And as someone on the board of KPFK, I think those have been unfortunately dividing line issues in Pacifica. Currently, you know, there's been support in Pacifica going back to the Kosovo, so you know, Bill Clinton's war on Yugoslavia, or the Rump of Yugoslavia, as you said, support for so-called humanitarian war, and there's currently a campaign of red baiting being waged inside Pacifica, targeting Answer and other groups that oppose war and support Palestine. And I think those are important questions for people to learn more about and to be on the right side.